Basic Economics, A Common Sense Guide to the Economy by Thomas Sowell. Picture this. It's the 1940s in New York City, and something bizarre is happening. Families are sleeping in garages. People have turned old trolley cars into makeshift homes. Relatives are cramming into tiny apartments, living on top of each other. The newspapers are screaming about a housing crisis that's tearing the city apart. Here's where it gets weird. There was no disaster. No war had destroyed the buildings. No earthquake had leveled the city. In fact, there was exactly the same amount of housing per person as there had been just a few years earlier, when everything was perfectly fine. The apartments were still there. The buildings were still standing. So what on earth was going on? What invisible hand was creating all this chaos, leaving people homeless, when homes were sitting right there, available? Believe it or not, the culprit was a law. A law that was supposed to help people. A well-meaning attempt to make housing more affordable by capping what landlords could charge for rent. Yet somehow, this policy designed to solve a problem created an absolute disaster instead. And here's the kicker. This exact same story has played out from Cairo to Stockholm, from ancient Rome to modern Zimbabwe. It reveals something profound about our world. Good intentions, without understanding how things actually work, can blow up in our faces in ways we never saw coming. Today, we're going to uncover these hidden forces. We're diving into a book that's been a guiding light for millions of people. A book with zero graphs, zero equations, and zero jargon. Just pure, crystallized common sense. We're exploring Basic Economics by the brilliant Thomas Sowell. Sowell isn't your typical economist. He's one of the great thinkers of our time. Born into poverty during the Great Depression, he left home as a teenager and built himself into an intellectual powerhouse. He writes with a clarity that comes from understanding not just numbers but people, history, and human nature itself. His promise in this book is beautifully simple. The fundamental principles of economics aren't hard to grasp. And once you get them, you'll never see the world the same way again. Ever wondered why some countries are swimming in wealth while others can barely keep the lights on? Why certain businesses dominate while others crumble? Or why policies that sound so reasonable on paper end up backfiring spectacularly? Stick with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll have a completely new lens for seeing the world. You'll understand the powerful, invisible logic shaping our lives, and you'll be able to cut through political rhetoric and media noise like a hot knife through butter. This isn't just about economics, it's about learning to think. Let's start with the most fundamental idea in all of economics, the concept that explains almost everything else. It's just one simple word: scarcity. What does that actually mean? Simply that there isn't enough of anything to satisfy all our desires. Think about the Garden of Eden. It was paradise precisely because everything existed in unlimited abundance. But here's the thing. Because there was no scarcity, there was no need to economize, and therefore there was no economics. We don't live in the Garden of Eden. In our world, everything is limited. Time, resources, energy, even a good spot on the beach. This single, simple fact forces us to make choices. Trade-offs. This is economics in a nutshell. The study of how we use scarce resources that have alternative uses. That's it. That's the foundation. Everything else flows from this one idea. If resources are scarce, then every society, whether it's capitalist, socialist, feudal, or a tribe in the Amazon, has to answer a few basic questions. What do we produce? How do we produce it? And who gets what's produced? In a feudal kingdom, the lord simply tells everyone what to do. In a communist state like the old Soviet Union, Central planners in Moscow issued millions of commands, deciding everything from steel production in Siberia to dam construction on the Volga River. But what about a modern, complex economy like ours? Who's in charge? Who decides how many iPhones get made, how many cups of coffee are brewed in a city each morning, or how many pairs of shoes get shipped from Fiji to America? The answer is no one. And this is where we meet the first hero of our story, the price. Most people see prices as obstacles, annoying numbers that prevent us from getting what we want. But Thomas Sowell wants us to see prices in a completely different light. Prices aren't obstacles. They're messengers, carrying vital information across a vast, global network. Imagine you're building a house. You need wood, steel, glass, and countless other materials. Each of those resources has thousands of potential uses. The steel could become a car, a bridge, or a paperclip. The wood could be furniture, paper, or a baseball bat. How does society decide where that steel or wood should go? It happens automatically, through prices. When you buy that wood and steel, you're bidding for it, competing with everyone else in the world who wants those same resources for something different. The price you pay reflects how much others value those resources. If demand for paper suddenly doubles, paper companies start bidding up the price of wood. That higher price sends a signal, like a ripple spreading across a pond, throughout the entire economy. Furniture makers and baseball bat manufacturers see the price of wood climbing. They have to raise their prices to cover costs. Some consumers, seeing the higher price for a wooden desk, might buy a steel desk instead. Without any central planner giving orders, people all over the world start adjusting their behavior, conserving wood, because the price told them it's become more scarce or more valued by others. This process works both ways. If a massive new deposit of iron ore is discovered, only a tiny fraction of the world's population will know about it. But everyone will soon discover that things made of steel are getting cheaper. The price is the messenger, delivering good news to millions of people who can adjust their choices accordingly. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, once visited Britain and asked Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher a question that revealed the mystery of the market. He asked, "How do you see to it that people get food?" She replied that she didn't. Prices did that. Think about the monumental task of supplying a city like London or New York with millions of tons of food every day. Every kind of fruit, vegetable, meat, and grain from all corners of the world. In the Soviet system, this required a massive bureaucracy of planners and officials, an army of people, just to coordinate the logistics. In a market economy, it all happens without a central plan. Prices are the invisible coordinators. If there's a bad harvest somewhere, the price of that crop rises, signaling to farmers elsewhere that there's greater demand. Profit-seeking suppliers rush to get their food to that market first to take advantage of high prices. In doing so, they deliver food to the hungry far faster than any humanitarian mission with salaried employees probably could. Prices don't just guide consumers. They're crucial guides for producers. How does a car company know what features to put in a car? They don't know what millions of individuals want. All they know is that when they produce one kind of car, it sells at a profit. When they produce another, it sits on the lot, gathering dust. This brings us to another central idea. The market is a profit and loss system. We hear a lot about profits, often negatively, but losses are just as important for the health of the economy. A profit signals that a business is using resources in a way consumers value. It's a reward for creating something people want and doing it efficiently. But a loss is a powerful, urgent signal. It tells a producer to stop. Stop making that product. Stop using those resources that way. Because consumers don't value the final output enough to cover its costs. Losses prevent society from endlessly wasting scarce resources on things people don't want. This is what happened in the Soviet Union. Without prices set by supply and demand, and without the discipline of profit and loss, chronic problems emerged. Warehouses overflowed with goods nobody wanted, while people stood in endless lines for basic necessities in short supply. Two Soviet economists described a situation where the government set a high price for moleskins. Hunters, responding to the incentive, trapped so many moles that warehouses filled with pelts. But the industry couldn't use them all, and they just sat there and rotted. Meanwhile, the Central Planning Committee was too busy tracking 24 million other prices to fix the problem. In a market, this could never last. The price of surplus moleskins would automatically fall, signaling hunters to stop trapping so many. The resources, the hunters, time and effort, would automatically redirect to something society needed more. So prices are the nervous system of an economy, transmitting information and coordinating the actions of millions. The profit and loss system is the mechanism of discipline and reward that forces everyone to pay attention to those signals. But what happens when we interfere with this system? What happens when we decide the message prices are sending is unpleasant and we try to shoot the messenger? This brings us to the crucial topic of price controls. Politicians often promise to make things more affordable by setting a legal limit on how high a price can go. This is called a price ceiling. The most common example is rent control. Let's go back to that housing shortage story in New York after World War II. The government imposed rent control to keep housing cheap. On the surface, it seems kind and compassionate. But what were the consequences? First, think about demand. When the price of something is artificially pushed down, people want more of it. Under rent control, young adults who might have lived with their parents another year decided to get their own apartment. People who might have had a roommate decided to live alone. Some people kept a rent-controlled apartment they barely used, just as a convenient place to stay when visiting the city. All of this increased the quantity of housing demanded. But what about supply? The supply of new housing dried up. Why would anyone build a new apartment building if the law prevents them from charging enough rent to cover their costs and make a profit? In Melbourne, Australia, for 9 years after rent control was imposed, not a single new apartment building was constructed. Even existing housing supply started shrinking. Landlords had no incentive to maintain their buildings. When you have a long line of desperate people wanting an apartment, you don't need to fix the leaky faucet or repaint the walls to attract a tenant. Buildings began deteriorating. Some landlords, finding that the cost of heat, hot water, and repairs exceeded the rent they could legally collect, simply walked away. They abandoned their buildings. Here we arrive at the terrible irony. In New York City, thousands of people slept on the streets, homeless. At the very same time, there were more than enough abandoned, boarded-up apartments to house every single one of them. The shortage wasn't a physical scarcity of housing. It was an artificial shortage created by a price control law intended to help. Good intentions led to disastrous consequences. Now, what about the opposite of a price ceiling? This is a price floor, a law that prevents a price from falling below a certain level. The most common examples are agricultural price supports and minimum wage laws. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, farmers were suffering terribly. Crop prices had fallen so low they couldn't pay their bills. So the government stepped in to help by setting price floors for farm products, guaranteeing higher prices than the market would offer. What happens when you set a price higher than what people are willing to pay? You get a surplus. And that's exactly what happened. The government had to buy up massive surpluses of food that farmers produced but couldn't sell to the public at artificially high prices. And what did they do with this food? At a time when millions of Americans were suffering from malnutrition, the government deliberately destroyed it. They bought and destroyed 6 million hogs in 1 year. They had farmers plow perfectly good crops back into the ground. They poured enormous amounts of milk down the sewers. Why? To keep the food off the market so the high price could be maintained. This sounds insane, but it's the logical consequence of a price floor. A surplus doesn't mean there's too much food relative to the population. It means there's too much relative to what people are willing and able to buy at the government-mandated price. The same tragic story has played out in India, where the government has mountains of rotting wheat in storage, while millions don't have enough to eat. The same principle applies to the minimum wage. A minimum wage law makes it illegal to pay a worker less than a certain amount per hour. For workers whose productivity is high enough to be worth that wage, the law has no effect. But for a young, inexperienced, or low-skilled worker whose labor might only be worth, say, $8 an hour to an employer, a law requiring $10 an hour makes him unaffordable. The result is a surplus of labor, which we call unemployment. The employer doesn't hire him, not out of greed, but because it would be a losing proposition. So the real minimum wage is always zero. That's the wage a person gets when they can't find a job at all, because a law has priced them out of the market. This is why unemployment rates are consistently highest among the young and low-skilled, the very people minimum wage laws supposedly help. Switzerland, a country with no minimum wage law, has for years had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world, often around 3%. We see that both trying to hold prices down and pushing them up can have severe counterproductive consequences. It disrupts the communication network of the economy and leads to misallocations of scarce resources. Now let's turn our attention from the market as a whole to the key players within it, businesses. We often think of businesses as static institutions, but Sowell paints a picture of constant, churning change. He tells the story of the A&P grocery chain, which in 1929 was the largest retailer of any kind in the entire world, with 15,000 stores. Today, it's virtually gone. What happened? A&P rose to dominance by being incredibly efficient, allowing it to charge lower prices than competitors. But then the world changed. After World War II, Americans moved to the suburbs. They had cars and refrigerators. They no longer needed a small neighborhood store they could walk to every day. They could drive to a large supermarket once a week and stock up. Supermarkets had huge advantages: buying in bulk, lower delivery costs, greater efficiency. New chains like Safeway understood this shift and built their businesses around it. A&P, the old giant, was slow to adapt. It clung too long to its old model of small urban stores. It began bleeding customers and money, eventually shrinking into a shadow of its former self. This story isn't unique. Pan American Airways, which pioneered ocean flights, went bankrupt. Smith Corona, the typewriter maker, couldn't survive the computer age. Eastman Kodak, king of photography for a century, sold 90% of all film in America in 1976. But it missed the digital revolution, a technology its own engineers had invented, and was forced into bankruptcy. The market is relentless. The profits that reward success and losses that punish failure force businesses to constantly adapt to changing realities and serve consumers better. It's a process of constant creative destruction. The ultimate beneficiary isn't any one company, but all of us, the consumers, who get better products at lower prices. This process highlights one of the most important and scarce resources in any economy: knowledge. Not just academic knowledge, but practical, on-the-ground knowledge of millions of different people about their own circumstances, preferences, and opportunities. A central planner in a government office can't possibly know all the things known by all the people in an economy. How can they know the best location for a new grocery store in a town they've never visited? Or how to best arrange items on the shelves? This is why entrepreneurs are vital. They're constantly experimenting, trying new things, seeking out and applying knowledge no one else has. Sam Walton, founder of Walmart, didn't start with a grand theory. He started as a clerk in a J.C. Penney store and learned the retail business from the ground up. He built his empire by obsessively focusing on efficiency, cutting costs, and passing savings to customers. He was tapping into a particular kind of knowledge that couldn't be taught in a university. And in a market economy, he didn't need anyone's permission. He just had to deliver the goods at a lower price. The success that followed forced his giant competitors, like Sears, to imitate him or risk extinction. This is the genius of a market system. It harnesses the scarce and scattered knowledge of millions of individuals and provides incentives for them to use that knowledge for others' benefit, even if their own motive is simply profit. Now, let's bring this down to the individual level. Why are some people paid so much more than others? We often hear about astronomical CEO or movie star pay and feel it's unfair. But pay isn't some arbitrary number. It's a price, the price of labor. And like all prices, it's determined by supply and demand. It's not just about how hard you work. It's about how much value your work adds to production of goods and services that other people are willing to pay for. This is called productivity. An engineer is paid more than a messenger, not because he's a better person, but because the supply of people who can do what he does is much smaller, and the value he adds to a company's earnings is much greater. But individual productivity isn't just about skill. It's also about the capital you work with and the management that organizes your work. An American worker might be paid 10 times as much as a worker in a poor country, but if he's working with 10 times the capital equipment in a highly efficient factory, he can produce more than 10 times the output. In that case, the American worker actually has lower labor costs per unit of output. This is why the high-wage fallacy, the idea that high-wage countries can't compete with low-wage countries, is a myth. Historically, high-wage, high-productivity countries like Britain and the United States have been the world's greatest exporters. Another powerful myth Sowell dismantles is the idea of a static, rich and poor. We constantly hear statistics about the top 1%, or the bottom 20%. But these statistics are deeply misleading because they're snapshots of income brackets, not movies of actual people's lives. Most people don't stay in the same income bracket their whole lives. Think about your own life. When you're a teenager with a part-time job, you're in a very low income bracket. As you gain education, skills, and experience, your income rises. You may reach peak earning years in your 40s or 50s, putting you in a much higher bracket. When you retire, your income falls again. Studies that actually follow the same individuals over time paint a picture of incredible upward mobility. One University of Michigan study found that of working Americans in the bottom 20% in 1975, 95% were out of that bracket by 1991. Not only that, but 29% had risen all the way to the top 20%. An IRS study following taxpayers from 1996 to 2005 found that income of those starting in the bottom 20% had increased on average by 91% over that decade. Meanwhile, income of those starting in the top 1% had actually fallen by 26%. There's tremendous turnover at the top and tremendous movement up from the bottom. The categories of the rich and the poor are constantly being populated by different people. This doesn't mean real poverty doesn't exist. It does. But the narrative of a fixed class structure, of a permanent divide between haves and have-nots, is largely a statistical illusion. Finally, let's zoom out to the biggest picture, the international economy. Why do countries trade with each other? For the same reasons individuals do. To get something they want at lower cost than producing it themselves. Two key principles are at work. The first is absolute advantage. This is the easy one. Americans buy bananas from Honduras because it's a tropical country where bananas can be grown far more cheaply than in, say, Minnesota. Honduras has an absolute advantage in banana production. But what if one country is better at producing everything? What if America can produce both computers and clothes more efficiently than a developing nation? Should it still trade? The answer is yes. And the reason is the beautiful, powerful principle of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage isn't about being the best at everything. It's about what you give up to produce something. The real cost of producing a computer is the clothes you could have produced with the same time, labor, and resources. Sowell uses a simple analogy. Imagine a brilliant eye surgeon who also happens to be a very fast car washer. He can wash a car faster than the young man he hires at the local car wash. Should the surgeon wash his own car? Of course not. The time he'd spend washing his car is time not spent performing surgery, where he earns hundreds or thousands of dollars an hour. Even though the surgeon has an absolute advantage in both surgery and car washing, the young man at the car wash has a comparative advantage in washing cars, because he's giving up far less to do it. The same is true for nations. Even if the United States is more efficient at producing both computers and clothes, it will have a comparative advantage in one, say, computers. The developing nation will have a comparative advantage in the other, clothes. Both countries will be richer if the U.S. specializes in computers and trades them for clothes made elsewhere. The total output of both goods increases for the world as a whole. This principle ensures there's a place for every nation in the global economy, no matter how poor, because every nation can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than other nations. This is why, for over a century, Britain didn't grow enough food to feed its own people. It focused on what it did best: manufacturing, shipping, finance, and used wealth from those industries to buy food from countries with a comparative advantage in agriculture. The British people were far better off than if their country had tried to be self-sufficient in food. So if trade is so beneficial, why do we see so many restrictions on it, like tariffs and quotas? Because while trade benefits the country as a whole, it can harm specific industries less efficient than their foreign competitors. When cheaper, better-made cars are imported, it's great for car buyers. But it's painful for domestic car companies and their workers losing business and jobs. These groups are organized, visible, and vocal. They lobby the government for protection, but this protection comes at huge cost to everyone else. When the U.S. government restricted imported steel to save jobs in the American steel industry, it raised the price of steel for every other American industry using it, from car makers to construction companies. These industries became less competitive, and it's estimated that for every job saved in the steel industry, 3 jobs were lost in other industries. This brings us to the end of our journey through the core ideas of basic economics. What we've discovered isn't a set of complex formulas, but a way of thinking. A way of thinking that begins with scarcity and choice, that sees prices as messengers, that understands the discipline of profit and loss, and that always asks the most important question in economics: and then what? It's a way of thinking that looks beyond immediate, visible effects of any action or policy and considers the long-run, indirect, and often unseen consequences for everyone. It's the application of structured common sense. And, as Thomas Sowell shows us, that kind of common sense is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding the world and making it better. So after this journey through the world of economics with Thomas Sowell as our guide, what's the great lesson we should take away? If I had to boil it all down to one idea, it would be this. Economics is the study of cause and effect. It's about understanding that our actions have consequences, and those consequences often ripple out in ways we don't expect. Sowell's great gift is teaching us to look past our intentions and focus on the incentives our actions create. We may intend for rent control to provide affordable housing, but if the incentive it creates is for landlords to stop building and maintaining apartments, the consequence will be a housing crisis. We may intend for a minimum wage to lift people out of poverty, but if the incentive it creates is for employers to hire fewer low-skilled workers, the consequence will be unemployment. This is why Sowell often says economics is about trade-offs, not solutions. There are no perfect answers. In a world of scarcity, every choice involves giving something up. The question isn't how to create a perfect world, but how to make the best possible trade-offs among available alternatives. This way of thinking is incredibly empowering, especially for young people today. You're constantly bombarded with messages from politicians, media, and activists, all claiming they have the solution to society's problems. They speak in terms of goals, a living wage, fair prices, or to save jobs. Basic economics gives you tools to look past those goals and analyze the policies being proposed. It allows you to ask tough questions. What incentives does this policy create? Who will pay the costs? What are the likely consequences, not just tomorrow, but next year and 10 years from now? This isn't a cynical way of looking at the world. It's realistic. It's understanding we can't simply command the world to be as we wish. We have to work within reality's constraints. The market, for all its imperfections, is a powerful mechanism for doing that. It's a process allowing millions of people to cooperate peacefully, to signal their needs and desires to one another, and to harness society's vast, scattered knowledge in a way no central planner could ever replicate. So what can you do with this knowledge starting today? Let me offer 3 simple practices. First, whenever you hear a proposal to solve a social problem, practice asking that crucial question, and then what? Don't just think about stage 1, the immediate and visible effect. Try to think about stage 2, stage 3, and all the unseen ripple effects that might follow. Second, start paying attention to prices as messengers. When you see the price of gasoline go up, don't just see it as a personal inconvenience. Ask yourself, what information is this price trying to tell me? Is there a supply disruption somewhere in the world? Is demand increasing in a rapidly growing country like China or India? See it as a piece of a giant global puzzle. Third, be skeptical of the zero-sum mindset, the idea that for one person to win, another must lose. This fallacy is at the heart of so many destructive ideas, from protectionism to class warfare. Remember that in a system of voluntary exchange, both sides must benefit, or the transaction wouldn't happen. Wealth isn't a fixed pie to be divided, it's created. That was a summary of Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. We've explored the core principles today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary can only give you a map of the territory. The real treasure is found when you walk the path yourself. The true power of this book lies in those quiet moments of reading, when a simple story or clear analogy suddenly illuminates a corner of the world you'd never understood before. This summary is meant to help you decide if this book deserves your time. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity, if you feel that desire to see the world with greater clarity, then I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning. It's an experience that can fundamentally change the way you think about your life and the world around you. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if this journey through a great mind has been valuable to you, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's continue to learn and grow together.